For 15 years, Arthur rode the same elevator every day. It wasn't that he enjoyed it, not particularly, but it was a part of his routine. He lived on the top floor of an old building in the city, and for Arthur, routines were all he had left. A few years ago, his wife Clara had passed away. She was the light of his life, always smiling, always bringing laughter to their home. Now, his days felt like empty echoes. And that elevator ride, it was just another step in his lonely journey from home to work. He'd press the button, wait for the doors to open, step in, and wait for the slow hum of the ride to end. And every day, he passed the same faces. Neighbors, co-workers, strangers. They'd nod or glance at him, but there were no real conversations. It was as if the elevator itself was a place where no one really existed. Arthur had never been the kind to speak up. He wasn't the type to break out of routine, but there was one thing missing from the elevator. His music, but everything was about to change. As sometimes, a small action can disrupt even the longest of routines. One rainy morning, as Arthur stepped into the elevator with his usual quiet demeanor, something caught his eye. A guitar case, placed carefully in the corner. He had seen the young man carrying it before, the one who worked on the first floor. The young man was always in a rush, never stopping to chat. But today, he wasn't in a rush. He was smiling. The guitar case caught Arthur's attention. It reminded him of the times when Clara used to sing in the living room. She had a beautiful voice, and Arthur would play along on his guitar. He hadn't picked up his instrument in years, not since she died. The thought of it brought both sadness and warmth, as memories flooded back. But today, something in him shifted. He reached for the guitar case, and as the elevator started its slow ascent, Arthur surprised himself. He pulled the guitar out and gently strummed a few notes. The sound was rusty, but it was still there. The familiar melody, though shaky at first, sparked something inside him, and it wasn't long before the elevator ride became something much more than routine. It was a Thursday morning, around 8 a.m. The elevator was crowded, the usual mix of people heading to work. The building was older, and the elevator was small, so there was no room to escape the sound. Arthur was just strumming, testing the strings, but he noticed that some people were looking at him. He hadn't meant for anyone to hear. It was a private moment, but as the elevator hummed upward, the music seemed to fill the small space. One by one, the faces around him softened. A woman with a coffee cup stopped scrolling through her phone. A man with headphones glanced up from his newspaper. Even the elevator's usual silence seemed to give way to the quiet strumming. Arthur continued, not looking at anyone, just playing the melody that felt like it was coming from somewhere deep inside. The song he was playing was simple, but it was enough. And then, as the elevator reached the 15th floor, the unexpected happened. Little did he know, this small act of breaking his routine would set off a chain of events, changing his life in a way he hadn't expected. It was the same elevator, the same slow ride, the same set of eyes watching him. But today, it felt different. Today, it wasn't just Arthur who had experienced something, it was everyone in that elevator. As the doors opened, the woman with the coffee cup gave him a smile. The man with the headphones gave a nod. It was brief, but it was real. For the first time in years, Arthur didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. Over the next few weeks, Arthur kept bringing his guitar with him, and the elevator rides began to change. More people started to listen. Some even asked him to play songs they remembered. He played tunes for them, some that reminded him of Clara, and others that just felt right for the moment. The elevator had always been a place where time stood still, but now, it felt alive with connection. He no longer stood in silence, waiting for his ride to be over. He waited for it to begin. But sometimes, it's not just the people who hear the music, it's the music itself that carries us through. Arthur didn't have a grand plan. He didn't mean to break the routine, but the more he played, the more it felt like he was healing. He began to sing softly to himself, though his voice still felt rusty. The music connected him with others, with memories of Clara, and with the part of himself that had been lost for so long. It wasn't about the attention. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about doing something he hadn't allowed himself to do for years. It was about letting go, about finding a small moment of peace in the midst of his grief. For those who listened, The music was a gift. For Arthur, it was a way back to a life he thought he'd lost. But one morning, everything changed, and this time, it wasn't just the music. It was another rainy Thursday, just like the first time he played. The elevator was packed with people. Arthur felt the familiar pull to his guitar, but this time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to play. He had played so many times by now. The faces in the elevator were the same, and yet, it didn't feel quite the same. But then, just as the elevator doors closed, a voice spoke up. "Could you play Here Comes the Sun?" A young woman asked softly. "It's my favorite." Arthur was surprised. He didn't think anyone remembered. He smiled and nodded, setting his fingers on the strings. The soft melody began, and as he sang, he noticed the people in the elevator were singing along. They didn't know the words perfectly, but they didn't care. They were together, in this moment. It wasn't just the music anymore, it was the healing that happened when they all shared it. From that day on, the elevator was never quite the same, and neither was Arthur. Weeks turned into months, and Arthur's routine continued. But now, it wasn't just a ride, it was a moment. He played every Thursday, without fail, and the elevator filled with people who had started to look forward to it. People who had once been strangers were now a community. One day, as he finished playing, and the doors opened to the 15th floor, a familiar voice spoke up. "Arthur, thank you for doing this," the young woman said, smiling. "You don't know how much it means to me." And Arthur realized, as he stepped out of the elevator, that he had found something he hadn't expected. He had found his purpose again. But as much as the music had healed him, there was still one last lesson for Arthur to learn. Arthur had never realized how deeply music had been woven into the fabric of his life. For years, it had been a quiet presence, a sound that comforted him in moments of joy and sorrow. But after Clara's passing, it had become something he couldn't touch, like a distant memory too painful to revisit. He had shut it out, afraid that if he played again, the floodgates of grief would open and drown him in loss. But standing there in the elevator, with his guitar in his hands, and his voice trembling through the first few notes, Arthur had made a decision, a choice to let himself feel again. The music wasn't just about sound, it was about reconnecting with something he had nearly lost. He wasn't just playing the notes anymore, he was allowing himself to heal, to rediscover the joy that had once filled his home, and to let the world around him see it. It wasn't until those people in the elevator, strangers even, started to listen, started to smile, and even sing along, that Arthur understood. It wasn't enough to carry music alone in his heart. It needed to be shared. The simple act of playing had become a way of connecting, not just to the past he had mourned, but to the present that still held meaning, and to the people who had been part of his journey without him even realizing it. Arthur's music had become a bridge, and with every strum, every note and every song, the distance between his grief and his healing shrank. The walls he had built to protect himself had slowly crumbled, not because he had forced them down, but because music had found its way in, and opened the door to something more beautiful than he had expected. A chance to move forward, to live again, and to help others along the way. The elevator had once been a place where time stood still, a place where Arthur felt alone in his quiet grief. But it had become so much more. It had become a sanctuary, a space where people came together, where they shared in something that transcended the usual rush of the day. And Arthur wasn't alone anymore. He was surrounded by a community that had found meaning in his music, just as he had found meaning in theirs. Sometimes, the smallest change in routine can shift the course of your life. Arthur's decision to break his silence, to play his guitar on those quiet mornings, had changed everything. His grief had not been erased, but it had been woven into the fabric of his new reality. It was no longer something that held him back. It was something he could carry with him, alongside the joy of connecting with others. The elevator had started as a mundane mechanical ride, just another part of his day. But it had turned into a place of healing, not just for Arthur, but for everyone who had been part of his journey. In a world where routine often ruled, Arthur had chosen to break free, to let his voice be heard, and in doing so, he had given others permission to do the same. Sometimes, breaking the silence is the first step in finding your voice again.